Welcome to The Cutting Edge. This is Chris Benner. I'm your host for tonight. I'm the faculty director of the Institute for Social Transformation, and I come to you once a month, usually on the first Sunday of the month, with interviews with people whose research and scholarship is making a difference in the world. And tonight, our theme is youth and climate change. And we're talking with Emily Reigh, who's an assistant professor of science education at UC Santa Cruz, and with Eloy Ortiz, who's the special project manager at Regeneración Pajaro Valley. And they've been working on a project that's recognizing that all too often when young people learn about climate change, it can be a very demoralizing experience when they see the scale of the problems. And what are ways in our education system and our community-based learning that we can help young people see and learn about climate change in their own community and how they can make a difference in day-to-day activities in their own community. And so, Eloy, I want to start with you to just tell us a little bit more about your work with Regeneración and why you were interested in building a partnership with Emily around this community-based climate justice learning project in Pajaro Valley.
Thanks for having me, Chris. At Regeneración, we really look at community to tell us what they want to see as projects that can reduce climate change impacts in the Pajaro Valley. We recognize that us as experts, me as a person that lives in North County, should not be coming into the Pajaro Valley and prescribing solutions for climate change. It is the community that knows, it was community members that know the community best. It's community members that are going to have the solutions for climate change. And I think what we want to do also, and we'll talk about this later, is build up community leadership amongst youth, build up their capacity to understand not only climate change, but how climate change is impacting social, environmental issues, how the city and the county function, and what their roles are in addressing climate change issues, and what they can do as residents, as youth, as leaders in the community to help empower not only themselves, but the youth that are coming behind them. Because as we've seen with the Pajaro flood, as we've seen with droughts, the impacts of climate change are so great in an area like the Pajaro Valley where there's so few resources for residents that residents are really going to have to organize themselves. They're really going to have to create solutions for themselves.
And Eloy, how did you get connected with Emily, and what was your interest in collaborating with her?
So right after the Pajaro floods, we as a climate change organization, probably the only one in the Central Coast region, received a lot of communications from
Mhm.
media, from researchers, and Emily was one of them. And I, as a person who worked in research prior to starting at Regeneración, am always interested in talking to researchers because I know the power of research. I know the potential, but I also know that sometimes researchers come in with their own agendas. So we started and we had a conversation. And all credit to Emily and a couple of other researchers, but they began showing up. And for me, showing up, being putting in effort to be part of the community or learning more about the community is super important. It's not just about coming in and having a one-time conversation and getting assigned a task or being paid for a task and just having kind of a transaction. But Emily and a few other researchers were really interested in developing partnerships. And I think all credit to Emily and Javier Gonzalez Rocha, Carolina Karlik. Those are Victoria Durr at CSUMB. They've been really great about establishing partnerships with our agency and showing really an interest in developing their knowledge about the community.
Great. Well, Emily, let's bring you into the conversation. Tell us a little bit about your focus in science education and what led you to being interested in reaching out to Eloy.
Yeah. So I am a former high school science teacher myself, and now I'm a teacher educator. So I work with people who are becoming teachers and also put on programs for in-service teachers to give them opportunities to really consider what they're teaching and how to think about linking the science teaching that we do in schools to the most pressing issues around us. Like you said in your introduction, the younger generation is very concerned about climate change and often brings a sense of anxiety. And I know that the typical ways that climate change is taught in science classrooms only propagates that anxiety. So science classrooms often only teach about the technical dimensions of the problem, and they often do it kind of at a global level that brings that sense of gloom and doom. The increase of CO2 in the atmosphere and extending that into models that are going to show what might happen in terms of global warming, in terms of more precipitation extremes, including both flooding and drought, which impact every one of us, but especially impact frontline communities in Pajaro, like the folks for whom, working in agriculture is their livelihood. They're experiencing this climate change on many different dimensions of their lives. And so, what I'm really passionate about is helping teachers to change the way they're talking about climate change in their classrooms. And so that means not just talking about it on a global level, but really bringing it down to local phenomena, local issues. And that takes a lot of work because that's not the type of curriculum that teachers are handed. But the other thing that I'm really passionate about is bringing forth community knowledge. Scientists often kind of in narrow views of what counts as scientific knowledge or scientific solutions can sometimes put community knowledge to the side in ways that I think are really problematic. And so kind of the second piece that I'm really interested in is helping teachers to connect to the existing organizing advocacy work, community-based climate solutions. This work is happening in every community, but it may be that science teachers in particular aren't keyed into that or don't necessarily have the time and resources to design learning experiences for students that make those types of connection to community. So I guess to circle back around to how Eloy and I met, that's what I was most passionate about is getting to know this new area that I'm working in. I've been in the Bay Area before, but now the Central Coast it's my second year. So to start really understanding who is this community? What are they already doing? What types of knowledge and community cultural wealth exist within this community so that I, as a researcher, can do the work of bridging that community-based work into the climate learning that's happening in local K-12 classrooms.
Well, and one of the ways that I learned about the incredible work that you two are doing is that, Emily, you applied for a small seed grant from the Institute for Social Transformation to host, along with Eloy, a networking event, a summit to bring together people locally who are working on science education and addressing climate change and its impacts in Pajaro. Do you want to say a little bit more about the purpose of that summit and what value you found in bringing those people together?
Yeah. So I think coming from a teaching background, I understand how many constraints are on teachers' time.
Mhm.
And they are just, they spend so many hours a day in a classroom, so much time outside kind of preparing that they often just don't have the bandwidth to attend different types of events that might put them in connection with different community members and vice versa. Folks in grassroots organizations like Eloy are also very, very time strapped and pulled in a lot of different directions. So with the funding for the Institute for Social Transformation, I was able to offer people stipends to come together for a day and really share their different perspectives and interests and ways that they wanted to grow in connecting their work. So we brought in a lot of different stakeholders. I brought in some local K-12 science teachers. Also some of my graduate students who come from different perspectives, not only science, but also ethnic studies perspectives. And we had Professor Leiva, also from UC Santa Cruz in Latin American and Latino studies, really bringing in social and political perspectives on talking about climate change, right? So really interesting to have people from these different disciplinary perspectives, science folks who are really trained to talk about kind of the cause and effect relationships or the evidence base we have for climate change, but folks from social sciences, political science perspective, who are talking about the social and political structures that have shaped the types of inequality that are also shaping people's experiences of climate change. So that merging of disciplinary perspectives was really powerful. And we also, of course, had two different community partners who do work with youth and adults, Regeneración from Pajaro Valley and Mycelium Youth Network from Oakland, who do a lot of work with youth thinking about climate. And then we brought in some young people that Eloy and I worked with directly in a photovoice project who had a very powerful experience telling their own stories of how they've seen climate change impact them in the Pajaro area. And it was maybe like a chance for teachers to talk with folks from science teachers to talk with folks from other disciplinary perspectives to kind of make them think more broadly beyond what a typical science curriculum prescribes, and also to see youth in different areas of their life, not just a student sitting down in the class, but rather a student who had participated outside of school in a civic action project to really show how much they care about climate change and want to share the stories of their communities.
And Eloy, I wanted to ask about that photovoice project, and maybe you could elaborate for people who aren't familiar with photovoice as a process, just a little bit about what it is, and then what you learned in that process of working with youth from Pajaro about climate change.
Yeah, so the Photovoice project was funded by the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Employee Resource Fund. And it was a very modest award, but what we wanted to do was we knew that the media coverage for the Pajaro floods was going to conclude at some point in time. There would be the next natural disaster, there would be the next big news story. So for a while, the Pajaro floods were big stories around the country, but we knew that the impacts were still going to be felt. They're still felt now, and we wanted to promote stories. And what we did was we recruited five Pajaro residents, and we asked them to take pictures to answer the question, what does climate change look like in the town of Pajaro? And we wanted them to not only focus on the flood and flood impacts, but we know that climate change had been impacting the area for quite some time, whether it be droughts, whether it be the heavy rains, and the flood, of course. But we knew that climate change had many different impacts for the area, and we wanted to bring the stories of residents, resurface the stories of residents, really highlight them. So we met 3 times, and it was an iterative process where folks took pictures, answering the question. They came back and they discussed the pictures, not only aesthetically, but what were the themes emerging. And so in that way, not only were we learning about their views, their priorities, their thoughts around climate change in the area, but they were learning from each other, and they were having a discussion where they kept learning from each other. At the end of the process, we selected a few pictures, and for each picture we had the resident write a quote describing what the picture meant to them. And we were able to display those photos and the quotes at a few places in the area, in Watsonville, at McHenry Library, at UC Santa Cruz, at the Seymour Center, and at the Natural History Museum. So it was a great, and at each of these events, especially the high schoolers had the opportunity to talk to members of the public to really highlight their stories. So it was a great leadership experience for all of them.
Well, and one of the things I find really powerful about photo voice projects, and the whole process is such an important part of it, as you described, not just the final product, is the incredible insights you get into people's thinking and understanding from just a simple image and a short phrase. And the one that really struck me looking through some of those was Ricardo was one of the students, and he has a photo that's looking out through some mesh in a window in the evening, kind of a fading light. And there are a few clouds emerging around in there. It's a beautiful photo, but he says it's titled Window. And he says, this photo was the first one I took. It describes how every rainfall, storm, or weather event, I live in fear of being left behind again or hurt. A beautiful view corrupted by my own thoughts. And that just struck me as like this little window into, the lived experience of youth in Pajaro in the face of, flooding, but also, the threats to people in the fields from heat events, the droughts, fires. There's so many different threats. I would really encourage listeners to go to the Regeneración Pajaro Valley website and look at the photovoice images because they're really powerful. And there are many images that are also about hope and resilience, not just, fear and some of the impacts.
Emily, I want to ask you about your perspectives on youth involvement in climate action. You brought to the summit a video of Isha Clarke, a really inspirational youth activist with a group in Oakland called Youth versus the Apocalypse, which is a great and provocative name. And can you just talk a little bit more about how you see the importance of youth involved in this kind of climate work?
Sure. Yeah. I included that video from Youth versus the Apocalypse in some of the activities that we did together in our climate summit because, I always enter this work from the science perspective, which is the disciplinary perspective that I was brought up in. But what I really appreciate about young folks, I think that youth have really expansive understandings of all of the different interconnected factors that relate to climate change. So in this video, the young activist talks not only about specific climate phenomena like global warming, but ties it to questions related to social inequality, to labor and labor protections. And I just thought it's just such a powerful example of the need to think across disciplinary perspectives, and for people with more of a science background like me, the need to really break open what we think kind of should count as our disciplinary content area to think about broader social structures, to think about labor and labor protections, to think about politics and policy, which often isn't like the space of comfort of science teachers. They are not social scientists unless they'd studied environmental studies at UC Santa Cruz, a wonderful program that explicitly bridges those divisions, but that's not the background of many of our teachers. So I think that's something that I'm really passionate about. And I think that teachers have a lot to learn from youth about the synthetic view they have of how climate is touching many areas of their life. And I think that view that they have is amplified in frontline communities, like the ones we have who are students may be very deeply tied to the agricultural sector and offer some really powerful perspectives like the ones that we see in these photos.
Well, and that's really powerful. And I love your connection between like the social science learning and the science education and the knowledge that youth have. And I mentioned some of your community-based air quality monitoring work too. I mean, there's an example, if I understand, I'd love to hear you talk more about it, of youth being involved in helping to generate the data that helps us better understand the science of air quality and where it's impacting communities. Is that right?
Yeah, that's kind of a new line of work. There are we found a lot of logistical challenges to that work, but yes, deeply tied to Eloy's work in thinking about greenhouse gases. We're also collaborating with Javier Gonzalez Rocha from UC Santa Cruz in applied mathematics, thinking about air quality in Pajaro Valley. And this is a really important area for further work because Pajaro is deeply underrepresented in the data that we are collecting. So in terms of regulatory sensors that kind of inform government agencies about air quality issues, they're very, very far from Pajaro. And in terms of community-based sensors, So what Javier works in are purple air monitors, which are freely available, relatively inexpensive, $150 or so, and put real-time data online for all residents of a community to see. But if you look at a purple air map, you will see an incredible concentration of air quality monitors in North County and very few in South County and basically none in the unincorporated area of Pajaro. So that's something that we're trying to work on with science teachers, is involving students in the process of installing these community-based monitors and thinking about the data that comes out from them and what the community can do with that data. So I think Eloy is going to be doing some work on that in the fall for some of these community input panels, but I guess I could just maybe take a little deviation to talk about a very specific project that I did with teachers, which was looking at air quality before and after the Moss Landing fire. A very interesting case in which arguments were made that the air quality was fine, but based on actually very limited data, given what we know about these data network sensors. And there was some really important science for us to think about, which is that the most harmful substances that may have put off from that battery fire, like heavy metals, are not easily measured by any of our existing air monitoring systems. So not only did we start to try to involve students in the process of installing more community-based monitors, but we designed lessons in which students looked at the data. Importantly, the limitations of the data, given what we know would have been the heavy metals that would have been in those batteries, the type of data that we were able to collect from air monitors, and then eventually over time, some data that came from soil sampling that showed that heavy metals must have cycled through the air in ways that our original data didn't collect. So we really want to involve students in both producing more and better data, but also really actively challenging the limitations of the data that we do have. And I think some of the final activities that teachers were thinking about with students were things like making public comment. So there's a lot of talk about this fire and about future battery storage facilities in the area, like at the county supervisors meeting and various fora. So something that we're considering is how we can prepare students to do things like make a 2-minute public comment that draws from what they learned in their science classes to make arguments about how to keep the community more safe moving forward. And Eloy, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the community input panels you're planning, but we had discussed also the possibility of bringing in our photovoice participants or maybe other students who participated in this air quality learning experience to be part of these community input panels.
Yeah, so Emily and I should say Emily and Regeneración are working on a second iteration of the photovoice project. Our first iteration really focused on Pajaro residents. This one will be broader and we are looking at high school students across the Pajaro Valley. So that includes both city of Watsonville and unincorporated Monterey County. That's Pajaro. And the idea is to have the series of photovoice workshops over the summer. And if all the students who participate in that are active and are interested, we would include them in our air quality monitoring workshops series that will take place in the fall because yeah, we're hoping there'll be some crossover. We're hoping to have an air quality monitoring week in our photovoice workshop so they can get and bring Javier in to talk about air quality and why it's important and all the things that Emily mentioned. So we're hoping to build these students' capacities to understand all these topics related to both climate change and the environment and the issues in the Pajaro Valley, and get their input, get their ideas about how air quality issues, how environmental justice issues are impacting their day-to-day lives.
One of the last questions I wanted to ask you to, and we're almost out of time, has to do with linking the Bay Area and our region, Pajaro, Watsonville, Salinas. You talked about partnering with the Mycelium Youth Network. And, often we think about these rural-urban divides, and rural areas, being literally blank spaces on the map when you look at that purple air, quality measuring tools, and often forgotten. But I wonder what you're seeing with youth who are learning about or being exposed to efforts kind of across that rural-urban divide, and what you see as the lessons for building, broader climate justice coalitions with youth leadership.
That's a really interesting question, and I think I'm gonna have to enter it from a different side, which is the teacher perspective. But I can comment on it from that perspective, which is I'm part of a larger research project. Some of the work that I've done with Eloy as well has benefited from funding from a University of California Office of the President Climate Action Grant. But our grant brings together researchers who are working with teachers across the two geographic contexts that you mentioned. So we have collaborators, so I'm at UC Santa Cruz, we have collaborators at CSU Monterey Bay, and then we have folks in the East Bay, CSU East Bay and Berkeley. And we are working primarily with East Bay teachers right now to think about climate issues, including air quality and precipitation extremes, the two that are also very salient in the Central Coast context, like we've been talking about. And what I can mention is that something that we're doing in our institutes is really asking teachers to think across the two contexts. So in the East Bay, we're actually using a piece of curriculum that Mycelium Youth Network developed about the Pajaro floods, where we look at some of the stories via photovoice, and also lift up a lot of the actions that the community has engaged in. I think that's something that we really care about is we do want to think about policy change, but also to think about building community resilience and community power. So part of this curriculum is highlighting many different actions that took place in this community, including a mutual aid campaign, including some of the work that Eloy has done, like the Climate of Hope Summit that brings residents together to talk about challenges and also solutions for the future.
That's really great. And Eloy, in the last 30 seconds, we'll give you the last word. What do you see as the value of partnering with groups in Oakland?
Well, just having that different perspective, our students often do not have the resources to leave the area. So having folks from Oakland, having folks from the Bay Area come to visit can give them different perspectives. They can see they can see how others live, and yeah, just open up their perspectives on issues that are impacting folks in cities and outside of their kind of daily lives here in the Pajaro Valley.
Great. Well, thank you both, Emily Reigh, Assistant Professor of Science Education at UC Santa Cruz, and Eloy Ortiz, Special Project Manager at Regeneración, Pajaro Valley. Your work is super inspiring, and I'd love to learn more about it today. You're listening to The Cutting Edge on KSQD 90.7. That's it for tonight.